Dear friends, welcome to another episode of today's military news. In this video, we'll discuss the executive order signed by President Trump, declaring a national emergency in the United States because of Cuba. A measure aimed at completely prohibiting the sale and supply of oil to the island's communist regime. Now that regime will finally fall, since the Communist Revolution of 1959, when Fidel Castro seized power and aligned himself with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Cuba has always been a thorn in the side of American foreign policy. A thorn that the United States has tried to remove in various ways, starting with an economic embargo that lasts to this day, in addition to failed attempts at regime change, such as the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 and numerous sanctions over the years. But with Trump, now in his second term, the approach has taken on a much more direct and forceful tone. During his first term, between 2017 and 2021, Trump reversed the diplomatic openings initiated by Barack Obama, such as the normalization of relations and the removal of Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terrorism. Trump also activated Title III of the Helms-Burton Act, allowing American citizens to sue foreign companies accused of using property confiscated by the Cuban Revolution, and imposed restrictions on travel, remittances, and financial transactions, a measure that profoundly affected the island's economy, which largely relied on remittances from Cubans living in the United States who sent dollars to family members on the island. All these measures were already stifling the Cuban economy, but now, in 2026, with the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro earlier this month, Trump sees a golden opportunity to tighten the noose even further and essentially deliver the coup de grace, with the executive order signed on January 29 being the heart of this strategy. Trump declared that the policies, practices, and actions of the Cuban government constitute a common and extraordinary threat to U.S. national security and foreign policy, and it was to combat this that he authorized additional tariffs on imports from any country that directly or indirectly supplies oil to Cuba. The focus is clear: to cut off the energy supply to the Caribbean island. For many years, since the times of Diego Chavez and Fidel Castro, Cuba depended directly on Venezuelan oil, which was exchanged for Cuban services such as medical, intelligence, and security. Moreover, despite the Cuban and Venezuelan regimes denying it for many years, we now know that the personal security of dictator Maduro was entirely guaranteed by Cuban soldiers, with more than 30 dying in the American attack of January 3rd. Thanks to this agreement, Cuba had what it so desperately wanted: enough oil to continue functioning. And Venezuela obtained in return forces in the most important medical sector for the Chavista regime, security and advisory services for the repression of the opposition. But now, with Maduro out of the game and the United States controlling Venezuelan oil assets, that source has dried up. Mexico, under President Claudia Sheinbaum, had become a new savior, sending some oil to alleviate the Cuban energy crisis. But now, with the threat of American tariffs, Mexico, a major trading partner of the United States, will certainly not continue with these shipments. Trump makes no secret of his objective, having recently declared that Cuba will not survive, further reinforcing that the island is on the verge of collapse. This pressure is not isolated, with the entire Trump administration, especially Secretary Marco Rubio, whose parents are Cuban, reinforcing this message. And this pressure against the Cuban regime, which, according to them, needs to fall for the country to prosper again. There are discussions about a possible naval blockade to prevent oil imports, as was done to Venezuela, and additional sanctions against the Cuban military conglomerates that control 60% of the economy. Furthermore, Cuba was reinstated on the list of state sponsors of terrorism at the very beginning of Trump's second term, and personal sanctions against communist leaders like President Miguel Diaz-Canel for human rights violations. Within the Trump administration and his circle of supporters, there is a feeling of optimism, with many viewing what happened in Venezuela as just the first step and believing it's now Cuba's turn. Now the central question: with the loss of Venezuelan oil from Mexico, will the United States finally overthrow the regime? For decades, the United States tried, but failed to overthrow the regime. Why would this be different? Cuba is in its worst crisis in decades, with its economy shrinking drastically. Shortages of food, medicine, and fuel. Blackouts lasting for days, and frequent popular protests. Unprecedented in the island's history, clearly demonstrating the level of popular discontent. Without oil, the blackouts will intensify and last even longer, paralyzing what remains of industry, services, and commerce. And this leads to even more protests and even a mass revolt against the regime. In fact, Trump and Rubio are betting on this, stating that the regime has never been so fragile, especially without the Venezuelan support that injected billions annually. According to analysts, the island could run completely out of fuel in a matter of 2 or at most 3 weeks, and when that happens, the collapse will be resounding, because the island will have nowhere to draw energy from, not even for the most basic services. In the view of some analysts, if this happens, we will see the complete civilizational collapse of that society. It is true that the Cuban regime has a long history of resistance and survival, especially in the 1990s, shortly after the end of the Soviet Union, which almost entirely supported the Cuban state. But the big difference now is twofold. The year 2026 means there is no charismatic historical figure in power, with the Cuban Communist Party led by Diaz-Canel, a bureaucrat seen as incapable of connecting with the people, and with Russia bogged down in Ukraine and lacking resources, and with China now more concerned with finding new suppliers of cheap oil, fearing to attract the wrath and trade tariffs of Trump. Cuba is weaker and more isolated than ever in the 6 decades of the island's communist dictatorship. Therefore, in this context, this could be the golden opportunity that the United States has been seeking to overthrow that regime and open space for a new, more democratic government aligned with Washington. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any news. Are you trying to choke off Cuba? I don't know. The word choke off is awfully tough. Cuba is the failing nation. And you have to feel bad for Cuba. They've treated people very badly. We have a lot of Cuban Americans who really were treated very badly, and they probably like to go back. And, no, I'm not trying to, but it looks like it's something that's just not going to be able to survive. I think Cuba will not be able to survive. You're just going to move to a couple of other issues. Your comments, that Havana should be concerned about the Maduro operation is feeling speculation that this administration will turn its sights to Cuba next. Will you make a public commitment today to rule out U.S. regime change in Cuba? Regime change? Yes. Oh no, I think we would love to see the regime going to change. We would like to. That doesn't mean that we're going to make it change. But we would love to see it change. There's no doubt about the fact that it would be of great benefit to the United States if Cuba was no longer governed by an autocratic regime. But you know what we mean by regime change. We don't mean I wish someone else were in charge. When we talk about regime change, we're talking about using the power of the United States, usually kinetic power, but often other kinds of coercion. And I'm not even saying that that's always not in our interest, I'm just saying. I'm not asking you whether we would prefer a different kind of government, I'm asking whether you are trying to precipitate the fall of the current regime. Yeah, but that's statutory. The Helms-Burton Act, the U.S. embargo on Cuba is codified. It was codified in law, and it requires regime change in order for us to lift the embargo. Okay,